Trust is a concept often taken for granted in our real-world social circles. It's the power that shapes our interactions and our relationships. Trust, or the looming uncertainty of it being betrayed, is what fuels the undercurrent of anxiety. Then you take a game like Dark and Darker, a player versus enemy versus player game. What that means, in short, is that you're fucked. PvEVP games often use this idea of trust to create a feeling of imbalance, exploiting our natural survival and community instincts to magnify the terror of lacking both. Titles like Tarkov, Dark and Darker, DayZ, and Sea of Thieves are the best examples of this dynamic. These games employ pacing, the threat of losing everything, and our perception of others' capacity to harm us to craft an atmosphere of fear. So what happens when this intricate dance of faith and doubt is thrown into what is already a difficult game? If you haven't played a game where trust is the difference between life and death, you might not truly know the intense nature of these games. As I said before, it becomes an entire mechanic capable of eliciting desperation and terror even in the most level-headed people. But what this game does that is so different from most PvP games is that it offers player versus player interactions as an option, rather than a mandatory element, which blows the concept of having to kill your enemy wide open. Let's start with the basics. I wanted to play Tarkov, but wanting to limit my exposure to slurs and not spend $60, the Dark and Darker was a game under my scope. This game is fresh out of the oven, only being 3 months old at the time of the video. I checked. The game itself is a difficult one on its own. If it were single player, I would equate it to Dark Souls. Not because of the game's aesthetic, but because of the learning curve and unspoken mechanics you have to figure out as you go. The game barely helps you out at all, only by giving you base gear to get started. The rest is on you to figure out, and with a game as fleshed out mechanically as this one, it's hard when you come into it not knowing anything. Immediately plunging you into an unknown world with unknown mechanics and the threat of other players who do know how to effectively play is the spark that sets off the intensity of the gameplay. Figuring out the game is a reward in itself though, and that reward was potent enough to make me crave more. The most unreliable part of this game is running into other players. When starting out, it's best to assume that someone is out for your body, and for good reason. Other players are often absolute bullies, taking pot shots from above you, hiding invisible behind a door you're going to open, and chasing you down with the biggest axe to ever grace your fresh little face. But sometimes this isn't the case at all. On the contrary, there are occasions where entire teams will form out of solo players looking for help. Even in the solo dungeons, it is rare but still possible to find someone that offers to help you out. So why is this game not as cut and dried as figuring out what the other player's intentions are? That rests on the shoulders of Dark and Darker's pacing. Good pacing is the road to intensity. The more controlled the pace is, the more on edge you feel. Most of these games use slower pacing to force you to take your time. In this game, it takes time and attention to scout out an area for its levels of safety. But getting to other areas, especially in blind spots like behind doors, is another whole problem. You have to be willing to take calculated risks and put yourself in a vulnerable position for some time in order to make that decent trade-off. And there is still a chance you'll lose it all and get sent back to the beginning.
Whoa!
Death.
That's right, boys.
Death. That's right, I didn't mention that when you die in this game, you lose everything on your body, reappearing in the tavern with the worst quality gear you can get your hands on. You're going to want to loot chests, bodies, and there's even slight incentives to hunt other players to take all the precious loot that they gathered just for you. You want to get out alive so you can stash your loot, sell the goodies, and dive back in with nothing. In the solo dungeon, it's simple. Kill things, gather shit, and pray a portal to the tavern appears near you before you die. In team modes, you can instead opt to go deeper, where the loot is better, the enemies are harder, and players are more bloodthirsty than before. That is why patience and time are keys to this game. Do you really want to die to the barbarian calling you racial slurs? He doesn't deserve your loot. So to break up the gameplay, other players are here as well. You need to stop and listen to determine whether that sound is another player's footsteps or a goblin smacking its bare feet on the wet cave floor. And when you're straining for the faintest of sounds, the game gets you immersed in more ways than one. It's not enough to be looking at a screen or clicking keys. The game needs to make you believe that you are an active participant of the world, being in just as much danger as the enemy is. When you do literally anything in the game, you give something up. If you want to loot chests and kill things, go right ahead, but every single thing makes noise and takes time. Not to mention, the things worth looking for and breaking for loot are the loudest sounds ever. Jars hold trinkets that you can sell for gold, barrels sometimes have something, and all crates often have decent equipment in there, but if you break them, you give up your location to the ill-willed assassin 4 rooms over. Most things in the dungeon are less dramatic than that, but chests often take your attention away from what's behind you, where if you're not under threat by a player, you're being hunted by a giant bug. That's right, fuck bugs. Your sense of sight, sound, and brain power are all used to make the best choice you can make. Well, everyone doesn't really play that way. As a barbarian, you can make all the noise you want because there's nobody on the other end of the baby monitor to tell you to go back to bed. You have health and strength. What else could you need? But play a rogue and God forbid you make a fraction of a misstep that you can't recover from. The rogue is a PvP bully, but getting there is mind-numbingly frustrating. The base health pool is one of the lowest in the game, and with the base daggers, you need to be in punching distance to hit anything, and even then, good fucking luck. Prick. If you don't know how to predict and evade enemy attacks, it's super hard to get a grip as a rogue. The health pool is another thing the game gets frustratingly right. Health is hard to come by. You can drink potions and use bandages, but they do very little overall. If you're caught with your pants down on the last pixel of a goblin sword, you can say goodbye to any little bits of health that you just regained. Of course, you can use campfires to regenerate health at a speedy level, but these are hard to find, so you often have to resort to sitting down and gaining 2 health points every 2 seconds. While this is part of the slow pace that the game uses to keep you on edge, this gameplay itself is absolutely exhilarating. I'm done. I don't want to do it anymore. I'm done. It is understandable that character types can be imbalanced because of the early state of the game. Skilled players have room to grow, but some character types are generally overwhelming and overpowered, especially in groups, which leads to the PvP bullies we find. It's why the knee-jerk reaction the game teaches you to have about other players is a negative one. But what if that wasn't the case? How do you trust someone in the game when they could kill you? How do they do the same when they're thinking the same things about you? On paper, this leads to the kind of stalemate in which we shouldn't group up because we can't trust each other, but in practice, that might not be. When you group up with a random, you both might be thinking about how you might be stabbed in the back, and sometimes people do take advantage of your friendliness to kill you with your back turned. Though the point of the game is to do what you need to survive, it's interesting that killing isn't forced and isn't always in your best interest. This is the same strategy games like Sea of Thieves or DayZ take, and it opens up opportunities for people to do interesting things. I suppose this essay isn't to provide solutions to our inherent lack of trust, but to crack the problem open overall and examine the different parts of it as best I can. Some people might say or think that these games show people's true colors, and while it might feel that way, I disagree entirely. These games enable people to engage in the most unusual situations that they wouldn't normally be able to engage with in real life. I think predicting the other person's intentions is, at best, a guess, and at worst, impossible and risky, because intentions in this style of game is all about how people feel in that particular moment. Humanity is unpredictable, and giving players the option to do what they can't normally do opens up opportunities to new ways to interact with other people. Because in the game, despite the immersion, despite the intensity, there is no outweighing the negative aspect of killing, betraying, befriending, or trusting someone. Well, that is, there are equally as many negatives as there are positives. No choice is the right or the wrong one to make, and outside of the game, making any of those beneficial or harmful choices doesn't make someone a good or a bad person. It doesn't matter at all. That is why trust is so fragile. It's why betrayal is often on the mind. It's why, when anticipating others' actions and in choosing to reject any possibility of cooperation before the chance even presents itself, you become to others what you found you're scared of getting caught by. And so, what do you do with other players then? Do you kill them out of fear, survival, or for loot? Do you pair up with them to better fend off the others? That is why trust in Dark and Darker is such a hard topic to properly dissect and analyze. There are a million ways it can go for you and others. That's what makes the game so hard to properly navigate when it comes whether to do or not to do. And that, dear viewer, is what makes them so fun. Loot is a driving factor for self-defense too. When you have nothing, you risk a lot less to put yourself out there, but get yourself a good set of gear, and hiding next door listening for the bare feet slapping on the floor in the other room gets your adrenaline surging. You tend to find valuables more than anything. These things just sell for gold, but the lowest level things sell for so little gold that it's not even worth bringing them back. However, like dying with tons of loot feels bad, it's almost equally as bad to escape with barely anything, so picking up armor and weapons you can't use can be a good way to make a little extra cash. It's also a good way to gain the trust of random players. You can drop good equipment for them and hope they don't use that brand new sword on your already broken ribcage. The inventory system is my favorite thing and a point of contention for me. Dark and Darker uses something similar to a Diablo 2 style system where you must organize and properly sort your gear. You can bring this stuff back to the stash, where you can store gear for higher level runs later on when you're going to need gear that does better than the basic gear you found while rummaging through the trash bin outside. Gold only stacks up to 10 per slot, meaning you'll have trouble storing hundreds of it. You can pay 5 gold to get a coin pouch that holds 50 gold per slot, which is not significantly better, but it does help conserve space. But to get gold in the first place, you need to escape, and it feels especially frustrating to not be able to do. I played the rogue for probably 10 games straight, lost them all, and switched to a new cleric character before finding I was escaping almost every time. So the skill gap can be hard to get across depending on who you are in real life and depending on how you play best. More dying means more understanding mechanics, and the more you get a hold of those, the more you're going to escape. More escapes means more gold, and more gold means better gear. But whether you bought gear from the tavern, found it in a jar, or tore it off the helpless bard in a hallway, your desire to survive grows as you gain more. After all, what is the point if you lost it all? That is where our fear of others comes into play. Even in groups, the fear of others persists. But the game doesn't throw a ton of players into a small dungeon, you're scattered in a big one. It does a good enough job of pretending to be a Dark Souls remake that if no players are in sight, you often go about your business. It does a good enough job of distracting you from staying vigilant about other players for literal seconds, and when you become too distracted at the wrong moment, the urgency and tension is acute, building fast and ending with you breathless. It's scary, and the closer the call, the scarier it is. My adrenaline surges when I hear that beautiful wet slapping when playing solos especially.
Get the fuck out of here.
Okay. I love playing in groups and solo, but the less of you there are, the more intense the panic is when your safety is in jeopardy. And your safety feeling like it's on the verge of being infringed on doesn't mean it's actually in danger. People might come up to form an alliance or simply to mind their business. But why assume that when assuming good intentions of others' ill will results in the loss of all of your treasure? And on the flip side, teamwork can be beautiful and can help you both achieve success and plenty of loot to bring back to the other side. I teamed just last night and was invited to play the duos map with him afterwards. I also offered to team with 2 other players in solos and got the priest's mace to my face. I think human unpredictability is the reason why we feel that we're more tuned to the side of not trusting others than we are to the other side. Not being able to anticipate anything other than death in already vulnerable situations causes us to go into fight or flight modes, both of which result in not having any trust for others, both of which could very well result in both success and in death. You see, the game is truly beautiful because there is never one cause and effect in a choice you can make. There are many things that cause you to make a variety of choices, and depending on RNG, how well you're playing, and how closely you've been paying attention, there are a million outcomes. Humanity isn't the only thing unpredictable. It's the presence of other players doing the same things as you that make the entire game a big gamble. So, from my perspective, with all of this being said and this interesting concept coming up, Dark and Darker holds an 8 out of 10 in my game rating, with plenty of fun to be had, plenty of lives to be lost, and many unique situations to encounter. No one run is going to be the same as the last. If you want to play this game, consider getting it, because even in its impressively fleshed out state now, it only goes up from here. And it's like half the price of Tarkov, I think. Thank you for watching this far. If you like essays like this, throw me a bone and subscribe or something. You don't have to. I'll see you in the dungeons, but until then, this was Crazy Jake.